some cases, it was alleged that this was being used by officials who didn't like what was being said about them, but I believe that there was also cases of companies or PR firms, so that you had this mechanism that's been put in place in terms of having, say, staff at particular companies whose role is to monitor and to delete content, to manipulate search engine results, which is actually a very important part of how the Chinese authorities manage information. And that this was then being used through bribery and things like that for more profit motivations. The other thing, and this is also another example where sometimes it's hard to know where the political and like the economic come in, but like China Central Television is the national state-run broadcaster, and and it's a very important tool for the government, especially its evening news broadcasts that are broadcast actually on multiple channels. And what's been happening with the advent of online video is that fewer and fewer, and especially with regards to breaking news, fewer and fewer people are watching CCTV evening news for their news. And so what we've seen recently, especially over the last year or two, is one, restrictions from the regulator on entertainment programming during prime time, but also increasing efforts to regulate online video, particularly like microfilms and things like that, would be like mini documentaries. And I think on the one hand, there's of course a political dimension to that, but another economic dimension also has to do with the advertising, for instance, that China Central Television gets, and the viewership ratings. I mean, some of the most expensive advertising slots in China are right after that evening news. So of course, there's also an economic dimension to that, and always questions about the relationship between China Central Television and some of these regulators, and whether they're making and issuing some of these decisions for the also for an economic benefit of CCTV.
Just one other point on the economic front. I mean, talking about, thank you. I don't know actually. You know, talking about what life is like as a internet user in China. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Great Firewall, which is probably the culprit here, causes the Chinese internet generally to be rather slow, particularly depending on which sites you're visiting. So I think, you know, no effort that I'm aware of has been made to sort of quantify the productivity loss from that. But that's another part of life, using the Chinese internet. And sometimes you're being punished for something that you did, but you don't know it because it never tells you. So if you search for a term that was sensitive, you may find that the site that you're on suddenly isn't working for 90 seconds or a few minutes, but you're never told why. So all these things obviously add up and shape your experience using the internet in China. Interestingly, on sort of the economic front, a really interesting argument that I read recently was in China Airborne, written by James Fallows, who's a well-known China watcher for many years. And he talked about how, I'm attempting to paraphrase his argument, as sort of China moves up the value chain and economic growth changes in its, changes in its character and goes for more sort of knowledge-based high-tech stuff. What do you do in a country where not only is the internet slower, but a lot of the sort of finest minds who would want to otherwise study, for example, at Tsinghua or Peking University, aren't able to use the internet in the same way, aren't able to access YouTube or Facebook or Twitter easily, to engage in a dialogue with the rest of the world. It's very hard to try to build a Silicon Valley type economy, for example, when you have the censorship. So I think in terms of the impact on economic productivity in China, it may be more of a forward-looking question than a backward-looking question. So we don't know, but I suspect that there will be some impact.
And of course, for individual companies, it's very costly. The fact that you have to have a staff that essentially, a department that are essentially doing work that in a lot of ways is actually not so productive, in some cases can be counterproductive for your company and its popularity. So that's, I think, where some of the economic costs for on maybe a company level comes in, but I think there hasn't been necessarily on a macro GDP scale like Rob was saying.
One more thing. So I agree with what these guys are saying. There is, of course, I don't know if we'll get into this or not. I mean, there are ways to jump the firewall. And I think that those who have the greatest economic, educational motives to find circumvention tools and use them probably do. And so this kind of mitigates that one piece. But certainly the point that if you're going to develop a wider knowledge-based economy, you're going to run into problems at some point. Yep.
Thanks so much. This will probably be my last question, but I want to make sure everybody has enough time. And if you have no more questions, then I will continue. But so just based on that last question, we're talking about profit and censorship. Sina, which David mentioned, is a company that runs the most popular microblog in China. It's listed on NASDAQ, so maybe we'll see some cases in the future where U.S. politicians in a particularly anti-China mood might try to target a company listed on an American stock exchange that's violating U.S. free speech laws. I don't know if that'll happen, but maybe. Anyway, so the next question is related to Weibo, so I'm going to direct it at David. It's about censorship again, and I want to know, is Sina, are they self-censoring? And in addition to that, are the people on the microblog censoring themselves? If I'm going to go talk about something, am I just going to go out, say I want to say something about former President Jiang Zemin, am I going to go just say his name, or am I going to use a code, or am I just not going to talk about him at all because I know that they're going to wipe it out anyways? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it depends a lot on. That's a great question. I think it depends on a lot of factors. So the short answer is yes. By all indications, Sina does censor its users, and exactly how many employees are engaged in that enterprise is open for debate. A recent study that I think a number of us at this table read by researchers at Rice and elsewhere estimated 4,000 employees at Sina based on the amount of heavy lifting that had been done manually to censor posts. And it's certainly true that users of these platforms also self-censor. I think a lot of it depends on who you are and what you're talking about. The more high profile you are, the more careful that you have to be. If during the time where there were rumors about Jiang Zemin's health, you probably would have been well advised to say nothing. If you were to refer to him right now by some coded name, you probably could, unless you were high profile. So this calculus is running through the mind of everyone who's using Weibo and these other platforms all of the time. It's constantly in the background, and frankly, I think what you often see online is a good deal of courage by these users. As you know, often people say talk is cheap, but it's not always cheap if you may actually be putting yourself at risk of detention or physical harm, however remote. And so I think, in a way, it's heartening to see just how courageous a lot of users of these platforms have been, given the stakes.
Well, it's that time. If you have a question, I don't know how it's going to work with microphones. I mean, you can shout.
This one's taped.
Yeah, we're kind of locked down here. I guess raise your hand if you have a question, and Elsa will come give you the microphone if you have any questions. Yeah. And Elsa. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know everybody's name in here.
Hi, I just want to thank you for a great panel. My first question is on the role of the Chinese, what's called like the human flesh search engine, and whether or not it's kind of being used as a tool to seek out corrupted officials and bring them to justice, or kind of more as a mob mentality, kind of being detrimental to society.
Is that just for any of the panelists? Okay, sure. And just very briefly, the human flesh search engine that he mentioned is this vigilante phenomenon in China where people will pick out someone who did something bad, and using the, basically crowdsourcing over the huge Chinese internet using population will find out who he is, where he lives, where his kids live, where his wife lives, or, everything about him, and go harass him. And I don't know, it's basically vigilantism. So
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. Thanks. I mean, I know that it happens, and it's had good effects and bad effects. Not to sound too wishy-washy here, but that's the truth. Yeah, I mean, you have examples where either the wrong person has been identified, or someone is being shamed for something that is not shameful. You know, you'll see targeting in particular of young women on the internet, which is horrible. And sometimes you'll see it used for what I think most of us would agree is good ends, in service essentially of government transparency. You definitely see cases where corrupt officials are spotted by keen-eyed web users doing something they shouldn't do, or wearing something that no honest official could afford. So there's a number of examples of this where, in fact, the careers of these local officials have been ended. And it's not quite human flesh search in that their identities were already known, but it is a sense of using the power of crowdsourcing to basically upend someone. A recent example is an official named Yang Da-tai, who was photographed smiling at the scene of a horrific accident. I think he was the head of the local Ministry of Transportation. It may have just been a nervous smile, but people didn't like it. And they, understandably, and they found pictures around the internet of him wearing various expensive watches. We're talking in the tens of thousands of US dollars. So his career is now over, and that happens frequently enough.
I would just add, I think when you look at broader rule of law issues, I think that's where, you know, the fact that this official who, for anyone who was actually really looking, let alone perhaps whoever in that, you know, segment is supposed to be responsible for rooting out corruption, you know, the fact that a netizen thousands of miles away might have figured out what color watch he said, and that sent up a red flag, I think that's where you end up with this inconsistency that, and perhaps unfairness that, well, why would he be in trouble as opposed to other officials who are wearing fancy watches, or the fact that it needed to wait for a netizen as opposed to having it be part of the process, whether it's like some of the asset disclosure things that were discussed or just a general sense of supervision of catching those kinds of things. So I think I think that's where in a lot of cases, and I think that's something to when we think of also, you know, how far can the internet go in terms of openness or transparency, it still can't really replace proper good governance institutions. And I think that's often when you see the government's response to those incidents is to dismiss that official, maybe if you're lucky, do a broader audit, say of whoever should have been of that office or something, but there isn't the kind of systemic change that would identify and really you know, address the underlying issues and broader phenomenon of that type of corruption in China.
Great. Before the next question, very quickly, Sarah used the word netizen, just so you're all clear. That just means Chinese internet user. I don't think I've ever seen it used to describe any other country's internet user. I've never seen American netizens used in an article.
And
but
of course, it's a combination of net and citizen.
Right, right.
In the sense of that empowerment that the internet.
And it is kind of a separate world on the Chinese internet. So, yeah, all the way in the back corner. This, yeah.
Hi, my question is, I feel Weibo in China is like is a success, but seems Twitter cannot attract as many netizens as possible here. So I'm wondering, so do you think is it because Weibo has better function or design, or is there some political or social reason behind it? And why, for example, in Weibo, both regular users and celebrities would like to show their voice, but in Twitter, most of the voice is from the celebrities. So that's my question. Thank you.
Is that to anybody in particular? Well, yeah, I think maybe we'll just let whoever wants to say it.
Well, I think there's a few things. One is the Chinese language, which you can fit a lot more in 140 characters than you can in English in terms of what you're able to say. There are certain functionalities on Weibo that have been more innovative, and that whether it's the commenting function, whether it's how images work, that allow people to share information in other ways. And there is the broader, I would say, the place, and I think David had spoken about this, the place that these this forum for public debate takes in China in a situation where there are so few other forums for public debate and discussion and sharing of information and getting information about breaking news, that's one of the, it creates a space that from the beginning, the moment that blogs arrived, I would say the percentage of Chinese internet users who were active on blogs and social media and writing was much larger than, as you note, outside in other countries, like in the United States, as active as people may be.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just comment more narrowly on some of the other differences between Weibo and Twitter in case it's helpful. There's the fact that Chinese is structurally different from English. And for those of you who haven't used Weibo, something else that's a bit different is that you can aggregate conversations around a particular tweet, particular post, a particular image. In Twitter, and I say this as a frequent user of Twitter, if you sort of miss something, it's gone, and you're not quite sure where a conversation begins or ends. So it's just a different functionality. And we were talking, Sarah and I were talking before this panel started about sort of whether people who allowed Weibo to be created or who created it had any idea what it would lead to. And I don't know, but the ability to comment on a post and for all of those comments to be aggregated in one place creates an ad hoc discussion forum, which, as you probably know if you use Weibo, is one of the things that makes it so powerful. And frankly, I think it must be something that the Chinese government is aware of, and I only say that because after rumors of a coup in Beijing in April of last year, they actually suspended the comment function only, which appeared to me to have more of a chilling effect on speech than the real name registration requirements, which have not been fully implemented. So there is a real difference there that you've identified, no question.
Let's not forget that Twitter's blocked in China. So it's in order to get to Twitter, you have another hurdle you have to get over. I think what's surprising is that there are as many people on Twitter in China as there are, rather than the other way around. So I find that very interesting. The other thing about the Chinese internet space is that the platforms there that are set up are closer to the old walled gardens, the kind of self-contained internet spaces. I referenced my AOL account before, and they don't work as well in the linking economy as platforms do in many other countries. And this is, I think it's to the detriment of the emergence of civil society online. Like we have the concept of the network public sphere, which is the interlinking of individuals on different platforms that can all be pulled together. And most of the Chinese platforms, they just don't interoperate that well as other platforms in other places. They're more like Facebook. And this inhibits conversations jumping from one regime to another, not one platform to another. So this is certainly another thing that we need to keep note.
One more just note about trust, and I think in terms of also understanding the role that, like, why people, especially for breaking news, why people would go to Weibo, is that if you're following someone who you've now built up a relationship of trust with, where you trust what they're reporting in a way that you don't trust the state media or the newspaper, that ends up filling a very important function. And so that's one way of thinking about why if someone wants to know what's happening in their society, they might be more inclined to go and see what this professor that they're following has to say about it, as opposed to reading the newspaper, which would perhaps be a bit different than how we would approach finding out information. I think in terms of whether we would go to Twitter to see what someone's tweeting, or we would do an online search or look something up on online for some other source of what we would perceive as credible information.
And sorry, just to jump in, BCG did a study, I think it was like a year ago, about who trusts what in China for their information. And among young and college-educated folks, internet was far and away number one, way ahead of print media, way ahead of television, despite the fact that it's filled with rumors and lies. So.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Elsa.
That's okay.
Yeah, if you can do that, yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, so actually, this was a question that I thought after the first question that you asked.
All right, the microphone's coming.
Okay, so this is a question that I thought of after the first question that we had brought up, so I wrote it down for, you guys spoke a little bit about how the internet kind of affects the organization and the collective sentiment of a lot of people in China, and we've seen with the Arab Spring, you know, kind of the power that social media can have in organizing kind of, you know, political movements, even, you know, kind of grassroots movements without any coherent, you know, leader or anything. Of course, I'm not really suggesting that, you know, the use of the internet now will lead to some kind of an overthrow of the current system, because as I was actually speaking with David about this last night, and as you aptly pointed out, it seems that the Chinese government is a lot more aware and less kind of oblivious to kind of the threat that internet, or, you know, that social media can have towards an oppressive kind of a government system than some of the Arab Spring, you know, governments did have. But I kind of wanted to know from you guys' experiences if there's any projection in the next 10 or 20 years that sees, you know, kind of an opening up of, you know, popular dialogue in a way that'll challenge the status quo, maybe open up China socially from the inside, or do you think that, you know, China has consolidated, the Chinese government has consolidated its control over kind of the internet and social media, and will they always be one step ahead of organization on the ground? And I guess that's kind of, I spoke with David about it last night. It's kind of directed at him, but I'd love to get Rob and Sarah's, you know, input on that and how that will be in the next, you know, 10, 20 years moving forward.
I'll take a shot at it. I always refuse to, thanks, I always refuse to make predictions about pretty much anything, but particularly the Chinese internet. So if I'm right, it'll only be because I was lucky. So I'll steer clear of that, but I will speak a bit about its ability to lead to collective action. I think clearly the Chinese internet and chatter on the Chinese internet has led to some changes in China at the political level. There's no question about it. As Sarah very aptly put it, that's not the same as there being fundamental structural reforms that, you know, spreads these changes in an even and rational way. But, you know, officials have been felled by human flesh search campaigns against them. You know, greater transparency about the degree of particulate matter, hazardous particulate matter in the Beijing air has come about because of complaints online, partly because of U.S. Embassy's conduct online in opening that up. And even a recent initiative that the Chinese President Xi Jinping started called the Clean Plate Campaign allegedly happened because he read a report privately made for government officials about how netizens were complaining about food waste. So there's definitely a degree of interactivity there, but that's very different because that's the Chinese government deciding, you know, hey, that's a good idea, or hey, yeah, this person really is corrupt. And that's not what you're describing. I think you're right, and I'll maybe end here, that the Chinese government is very aware of how it can seek to prevent collective action on the internet. And the target of their censorship is not simply anti-government posts. Many of those actually are allowed to stay, but cases where it thinks that people will actually hit the ground because of it. So I'll steer clear of any predictions.
Hey, so I want to jump in here too. This is a really important question, so thank you for that. I want to start by taking issue with your description of the Arab Spring. I think the notion that it was leaderless in some manner is just not right. We've done studies of blogospheres in the region, and you can see the seeds of this revolution developing 5 and 10 years prior to the actual revolution itself. It was individuals that felt very strongly, took a stand, wrote about the things that they felt would really resonate, creating frames of collective action online, trying out ideas, failing, trying new ideas, and these major players could be seen in the history of the blogosphere. And the big difference between Egypt and China is that Egypt allowed this to happen, and were they to do it again, I think Mubarak would probably take a different stance on the internet there. I also want to repeat what I said before. I think that political change and social action is driven by organizations, and these organizations need leaders, they need people with real names. There aren't examples of anonymous organizations that are successful in carrying out long-term political change. They just don't exist. I mean, the closest thing we have is Anonymous itself, which we know what it does and what it doesn't do well. And I'd also like to tie your question back, because I think it's pretty cool, to the human flesh engine question before as well, is that I think there is an alternative where civil society organizations are not allowed to form online, is these single issue, more spontaneous reactions among netizens. And I think we'll see more of that, and you'll probably see even more of that, where civil society organizations are not allowed to take shape. That has an upside, it has a downside, and it's similar to the human flesh engines on the upsides and downsides. Where they're focused in productive ways, they can highlight areas that need reform, and they can force the government to respond to that. So we could, in effect, end up with more and better responsive government, even in authoritarian regimes, pardon me. There's a downside to that as well, is that they don't have the long-term networks and interactions that lead to discussions and debate and allow better ideas to kind of bubble up to the top and to prioritize ideas in the public sphere.
I agree with Rob. I think it's a very good question. If it's the last one, it's a very apt one to end on. I read there's an academic piece that came out recently there was actually a whole series in the Journal of Democracy on this question: is China at the tipping point? And one of them that particularly struck me was that used the term networks of contention. And I think that I found that really thoughtful, because I think that is what you see in China. It's that there is civil society, there are networks. Not everything that the internet isn't only what happens in the blogosphere on microblogs. You have a lot of communication that's actually done over Twitter. You have a lot of communication and networking among activists and among other populations within China in an offline sphere. You have dissemination of various kinds of, you have peer-to-peer dissemination of books. You have books coming in from Hong Kong. You have a wide range of way in which Chinese people get information and communicate with each other that the government would want them. And I would say in some cases, also organizing. You have more and more collective petitions. Just recently, there was a case of a human rights lawyer who was detained, and a bunch of lawyers wrote about it. Some of it was online, some of it was offline. The fellow was released a couple of days later. You have things like that happening even on very sensitive topics. There have been more and more cases of villagers coming together to sign petitions for a Falun Gong neighbor who had been detained unjustly. So I think you have things like that where people are finding other ways that are offline. And of course, this question of the mass incidents and the protests. But the point that Rob raised about the leadership is important. So part of the challenge is you've got these networks of contention. But one of the other things that the Chinese government is very good at is isolating the people who have the leadership potential. So actually, when you look at things that are censored, it's ironic that some of the most censored names on the internet are, on the one hand, people like Xi Jinping or Bo Xilai, now, or Hu Jintao. But on the other hand, people like Ai Weiwei or Liu Xiaobo or Gao Zhisheng. So if you want to ask a question, what does Liu Xiaobo, have in common with Hu Jintao? Or then it might be that both of their names, if you just wrote them without any kind of coding, are very tightly censored on the Chinese internet. And that's also one of these tipping point things that, particularly for some of the celebrity microbloggers, I think people are very aware of. Those individuals are very aware of in terms of what they say and how they act and things like that. Because while the Chinese government is allowing a certain level of opinion leaders, if you overstep a certain boundary, then even if you're not detained or sent away to a prison in Xinjiang, like this lawyer Gao Zhisheng is. We did a study, actually, we called it cyber disappearance, because it's like this virtual version of what the Soviets used to do of crossing people out of pictures. They can just they can just make people disappear. In some cases, there are people like Gao Zhisheng, who was one of the top 10 lawyers in China, and this by the Ministry of Justice, or Ai Weiwei, who had been, promoted as someone who was an artist who had designed the bird's nest for the Olympics and then fell out of favor. You have personalities like that, where it isn't just that someone was a relatively anonymous activist. It's individuals like that that the Chinese government is most fearful of.
Thank you. So this is going to be the last question, so please keep the question quick and don't accuse me of censorship, but this might need to require quicker answers just for the last one. So you can pick, Elsa.
I'm a senior at Boston University. My name is Linda Zhang. I am directing my question at Dr. Faris, but I'd like to hear, everyone else's opinion if time allows for it. We've talked a lot about the economic effects of internet censorship. My question is it worth it politically? Does censorship keep stability in China going, or does it create a growing frustration among citizens that will have more potential for domestic conflict in the future? Thank you.
Wow, that's a great question. You sure you don't want the others to answer that? I don't know. I mean, who knows? I think that there is there's very strong arguments on either side, and it's really difficult to read the tea leaves on this one. I think in some cases, a lot of people would make the case for slower, gradual change is a road towards stability, and that's a very compelling argument. I can say that the government is obviously very sensitive to this question, and they're thinking deeply about it, and it's not just in China, but in all countries around the world. It seems like the line at which the censors draw is a political one, and it's trying to draw the line saying how far can we go in restricting activity online while maintaining our legitimacy to govern. And when they go over that line and lose their legitimacy to govern, classic examples include Burma, Mubarak, when he shut down the internet, they were saying we've given up on any sense of legitimacy and we're just going to try to hold on to power. And so you know when they've gone too far.
I think the legitimacy thing is an important part of this puzzle in terms of the way in which, and this question of whether the regime is able to manage this responsiveness in a way that maintains their legitimacy, or if the censorship even and of itself and other information that's circulating erodes the legitimacy. But it seems like the barrier right now is more on some of these other levels that we've described, which is actually the offline part of whether it's organizing or taking to the streets and the courage, the tremendous courage people have to speak online, but to go do something offline often takes, particularly in China, an even higher barrier of courage. So in a lot of ways, it's really that offline-online dimension that is the critical question, because I think when you see what people are writing online, you can see the legitimacy problems that the Chinese Communist Party faces right now.
Well, I actually didn't have a whole lot to add to these answers, but one interesting thing worth noting is, of course, the Chinese government could avoid the need to censor everybody all the time simply by, I guess, shutting down these web platforms, which I guess is a huge and nihilistic act of censorship. But why don't they, if censorship is becoming a fact of life for so many people, whereas Sarah noted it used to be simply the province of a few newspaper reporters and editors. And I think the answer is that they've made the calculus that partly I think they can't, actually. I think there's a great deal of attachment to these online platforms, and there is a nascent sense of community that's hard to describe or instantiate, but I think is very real. And so the government, I think, would face a great deal of blowback if they simply killed these platforms. And maybe they've determined actually it's good because it, again, acts as a steam valve for people who are discontent and keeps them from doing something else. But so I think, frankly, that this is a bargain that the Chinese government is has made, and it's a dynamic now that they're stuck in, where they are not going to simply lift the veil and stop censoring, but they can't make these platforms go away. So I think it's going to be very interesting, actually, to see how this discontent about censorship ultimately plays out. It's a great question.
Well, that wraps it up. And thank you so much to our panelists here. Let's give them a really big hand because... I now have to go home and completely rework my thesis because of everything I heard today. It was so informative and really, really interesting. So that was great. Thank you. Thank you all.
The next panel will be starting in about 5 minutes. That will be on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you. This is from Sarah.
Hey, Matt. Nice to meet you. 1 second. No, of course. Sure, yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. Yes. Full, but I think we got really good, really robust discussion.